Hey y'all, Nefertiti, the Corny Rainbow here, and I'm back with another sew along for you guys. And this is for McCall's 8560. This is a quilted style jacket, and I have yet to make one of these, so I'm really excited about sewing up this pattern. In today's sew along, I'm going to be doing view A, which is the view that has the ribbing for the sleeves. The pattern does call for an inner lining of fleece or low loft batting. You should be able to find those products and notions at your local craft store. Let's go ahead and get into the sew along. For all my quilters out there, this pattern should be a breeze for you. I'm not personally a quilter, so this is new to me, and I'm going to show you guys two ways that you can cut out and quilt your pattern. So let's start with the pattern pieces that you're going to need. So first you're going to need pattern piece number one. Pattern piece number one is your block for your front pieces. You're going to need to cut out one pattern piece of this entire square of your fabric, one pattern piece of your inner lining, and then one pattern piece of your lining. So this is not going to be like a traditional cutting out the front piece, the sleeves, and the back. You're going to cut out these blocks first. So this being our front, I'm going to give you guys an example of how we're going to layer them and then stitch them together on the stitch lines here. Pattern piece number two, this is your block for your pocket quilting. So you're going to do the same, cut out one of fabric, one of inner lining, and one of lining. Pattern piece number three, you're going to cut out one of fabric, one of interlining, and one of lining. And lastly, for your quilt blocks, you're going to need to cut out pattern piece number four, which is your block for your sleeve quilting. You're going to cut out two of fabric. You're going to cut out two of inner lining and two of lining. All right. All right, so I've gone ahead and cut out pattern piece number 9, which is our sleeve front. And I'm going to be using this as an example to show you how you're going to need to layer your fabric for quilting. I couldn't use the method that the pattern calls for blocking, and because I had to play Tetris with my fabric, so I had to cut mine out a little bit different. And what I did was I cut out the lining, which this is the right side of the lining. I cut out my interlining, and then I cut out the pattern piece of the inner lining and the pattern piece of the fabric the correct size, and then I left a little bit of space for my lining. So what you're going to need to do is just imagine that this was a full block. I pinned it down, and with wrong sides together to your inner lining and your lining, pin, and then we're going to get out that pattern piece number 4, and we're going to use it as a guide for our stitch lines. Directional lines here as my guide. So I'm going to flip this over. So I'm just going to lay this block pattern piece over that directional line as well. I'm just going to mark where these lines should land at the top of this pattern piece. If you had enough fabric to cut out the actual block itself, then you wouldn't need to do this the way that I'm doing, but you would still need to transfer your stitch lines to your fabric. And we're going to top stitch on the right side of our actual fabric. I'm going to put this block for our sleeve to the side, and also pattern piece number 9. The stitch lines are 2 inches apart. You can get creative with your stitch lines. If you want to go vertical and horizontal, you can do that. I do have a seam guide on my machine, so I'm going to use this pattern piece, and this is also the way that you will be stitching your blocks. So we're going to go ahead and head over to the machine. All right, so as you can see, I have my seam guide attached, and it's already set to 2 inches. I do apologize. My thread is black and my fabric is black, so you may not be able to see these stitches. I'm going to be stitching vertical and horizontal lines here. You don't have to do that, but I'll show you guys what that looks like. Then you're going to move on to the next row here and stitch down. But on the inner lining, you can see the stitches, and I used a white thread for the inside because I felt like the black was a little too harsh for the lining. But go ahead and finish quilting all of your blocks, and then we're going to move on to the next step. As you can see, I've gone ahead and I've sewn vertical and horizontal lines on my block. If you decide to do your blocks this way, this is how it would look. And then you would just cut off the excess of your lining. Unless you had to play Tetris like me, these pattern pieces you're going to place over your blocks once you've quilted them, and then you're going to cut out your pattern pieces. Let's get into those pattern pieces that you're going to need. Here is pattern piece number 9, our sleeve front. Pattern piece number 6, which is our front. You're going to cut out 2 on top of your block. This is pattern piece number 8, and this is cut 1 on the fold. So basically you're cutting 1, and if you blocked out your fabric with pattern piece number 3, this is how it would look. So we would turn it so that our stitch lines are going in the direction of our grain, and you would place your pattern piece on top of your finished block. And there's a line for your back where you would place your pattern piece number 8, and then you would flip it to the other side and cut it out that way. So you're not actually going to fold this, at least I wouldn't. You would just flip it over and then pin it down and cut it out on your finished block. This is how you should do all of your pattern pieces that you're not actually going to cut out initially of the fabric. Pattern piece number 10, which is your sleeve back. You're going to cut out 2 on your finished sleeve block. Pattern piece number 11, if you're doing view A. I am doing view A, so you're going to cut out 2 of your rib knit. Pattern piece number 5, you're going to cut out 2, and this is going to be used for your binding. There are cut lines on this pattern piece as well. So once you have stitched matching at the notches, we're going to be cutting, making our own bias binding, unless you would like to use store-bought binding. And lastly, pattern piece number 7, you're going to need to cut out 2 on your finished pocket block. Pattern piece number 12, you don't need to cut anything out of, but you will be using this as a guide for your button or buttonholes. And this sew along, I'm going to be using snaps. So I'm still going to use this as a guide, but I won't be stitching buttonholes on this particular jacket. All right, first we're going to grab one of our front pieces, and we're going to go ahead and work on our pocket. You should have transferred your markings for your pocket placement. We're just going to line our pocket up with the markings. and we're going to transfer our stitch lines to the pocket so that it matches up nicely. All right, so I've gone ahead and quilted my pocket. So now you're going to cut a piece of your binding that you made, or if you're like me, I chose to use a store-bought bias binding for quilting, and I'm using a double fold bias tape quilt binding, 0.875 inches wide. Go ahead and start your bias with your upper edge, and then we're going to cut. We're going to fold down just a little bit of the edge, and then we're going to start on the outer. Let's go ahead and head over to the machine and stitch down our upper edge first, and then we're going to work our way around, and we're just going to be edge stitching right along the bias tape. All right, now we're going to fold down that edge again. All right, now you're going to fold at the end here. Just clean everything up. All right, let's attach it to our jacket. You should be able to just match it up with your stitching lines now, but also have those markings for where to place your pocket. And go ahead and pin. We're only going to be stitching over our stitching line on our bias tape. So just go over your existing stitches and then meet me back here. Be sure not to stitch down the actual upper edge of the pocket. So I've gone ahead and stitched down my pocket. Now we're going to grab our sleeve front. All right, so you should have a single notch on your sleeve front and also on your front piece. We're going to be matching up the notches wrong sides together, okay? So your raw edges are going to be facing you, okay? So go ahead and pin, matching up your notches. Go ahead and head over to the machine, and we're going to stitch down with wrong sides together at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and press and trim down your seam allowance. Then cut out a piece of your bias binding from shoulder to underarm. And we're just going to place the bias binding right over the seam allowance that we've trimmed down. And then we're going to stitch on both edges of our bias binding. All right, let's head over to the machine and stitch this down. All right, so I've trimmed the seam down, and you do want to make sure that your seam is going towards your front pattern piece. So go ahead and stitch. All right, y'all, what we do to the front, we have to do to the back. So go ahead and grab your back pattern piece and your back sleeve. So we do have a dart in our back sleeve. So go ahead and pin and stitch your dart together. Go ahead and stitch your dart and then press your dart towards the lower edge of your sleeve. Now we're going to grab our back. I went ahead and attached my right sleeve. I didn't trim anything down or add the bias binding yet, but this is how we're going to be stitching it the same exact way that we did the front. So go ahead and pin, matching your double notches with wrong sides together. Go ahead and head over to the machine, and we're going to stitch this down wrong sides together at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, the same exact way that we did our front pieces, and then we're going to add our bias binding. Go ahead and pin your front to your back with wrong sides together only at the shoulder seam. So you should have a notch on your shoulder and also 2 notches on your sleeve. Go ahead and pin, and we're going to stitch all the way down this shoulder seam at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then we're going to do the same thing with our bias binding that we did for our sleeve. So let's go ahead and head over to the machine. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've stitched down the bias binding on the entire shoulder seam here. So now you're going to grab your binding, and we're going to start from the bottom edge of our front piece, and we're going to go all the way up and around our neck edge, coming all the way down to our second front piece, and then at the edge of our front. You're gonna need a very long piece of bias binding. This is actually an entire pack of bias binding, so just keep in mind this is the longest part of binding that you're going to use for the pattern. So let's head over to the machine and stitch this down. Now we're going to add the bias tape to the back. Once we've got our binding going all the way around our neck edge and our front and our back pieces, you should have also just stopped at the corner edge of your front and back pieces. As you can see from the inside, it's nice and clean. Just as it's sitting, we're going to go ahead and pin, matching up our seam lines, and we're going to stitch this underarm side seam all together. All right, so go ahead and match up your underarm seams first. Once you've pinned your underarm seam, go ahead and head over to the machine, and we're going to stitch this down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. When I get to the bias binding, I'm just going to hand wind my bobbin because it's a lot of thickness there. On both of those seams, we're going to go ahead and add our bias binding. When you are stitching the binding on to the sleeve, this is going to be probably the toughest area for you to get into. And I've already stitched down one side of the bias binding, but you do want to keep in mind that you are going through a lot of fabric, especially right where your bias binding meets. So trim that down and thin it out as much as you can so that you don't have too much bulk in the way once you go over this seam here. And just also hand wind your bobbin. If you think it might be a little too tough for you to go over it, always hand wind, or you're going to be breaking a bunch of needles. I went ahead because I've sewn my entire garment with my leather needle because I am working with a faux leather. I switched my needle out for this portion of the sew along because my needle sounded like it was catching on my fabric a little too much. So do keep that in mind, and if you like, use a longer stitch width. So the current stitch width that I'm using is a 3.6 to go over my binding. If I was to use the 2.5 stitch width, it would be a little bit more challenging, and we can still secure the garment with a 3.6. So just do keep that in mind. I'm going to show you guys how tough, and really depending on the fabric that you're using too. I did, like I said, chose a faux leather and it's a little bit harder to really get in the sleeve here. And you're gonna have to do this 4 times. 1 time down the right side of the bias binding, and 1 time on the left side of the bias binding, and then twice on your other underarm. Gonna want to make sure your needle is as sharp as possible to really get down in those thick layered areas. And as you can see, I'm just kind of spreading the sleeve. You might just want to stick your hand in there as we get closer to the end and just make sure that you're not catching any fabric underneath here. That's why I'm spreading the sleeve open. Stitching a little bit and then separating and really pushing all of the fabric out of the way does help. If you're doing view B or C, you would need an extra about 1/4 of an inch of bias binding towards the end. I did use the extra length on the beginning, as you can see here, and I folded it under and stitched down. But for the end of the sleeve, I did not, because I'm going to be adding ribbing to my wrist. All right, so go ahead and do that to the other side. All right, if you've made it this far, then you literally only have a couple more steps left. If you're doing view B and view C, then you would add your binding along the edge of your sleeves. I'm doing view A, which requires ribbing. For the ribbing, you can cut out 2 for your sleeve band of pattern piece 11. You stitch with right sides together, matching your notches at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you would fold the sleeve band in half with wrong sides together. I like to repurpose my clothes, so I'm just going to be using a existing sleeve from a sweater that I already had, because I didn't have ribbing this color, and this is the shade that I wanted to add. Cutting the ribbing off, and we're going to repurpose. Match your seam allowance with your underarm seam. Stretch it to fit. All right, let's head over to the machine. Stitching this down at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance through all thickness. All right, go ahead and stitch again at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and if you like, you can serge your raw edge. The last thing that you have left is to attach your buttons and buttonholes. Get pattern piece number 12 to use as a guide. And if you're doing view C, make sure to cut out the buttonhole guide for view C, because that view is longer than view A and B. And we are all done. Thanks so much for sewing along with me.